Hello, fellow MDDE 651 students. I'm Sarah Fairbrother. I picked content and curriculum issues for practitioners as the topic of my presentation. So basically, this entire slide is going to be aspects of feminine pedagogy in theory and practice and the barriers that are preventing them from actually being enacted. The reason that I picked this particular subject is that I am a teacher and I do actually teach in several different capacities from 5-year olds all the way up to, I think one of my last adult students was like pushing 70. And in each of these environments, there's definitely content issues where it's very one-sided, very biased, and the presentation that you are expected to give when you are teaching these things subscribes to a very quantitative approach rather than a qualitative one. One of the root questions that I was using when I was doing my research is, does a lack of feminine pedagogy further the gap of equitable respect and representation in professional fields? So, feminine pedagogy is often associated with more of an emotional intelligence. So, like I mentioned before, it's more of a qualitative approach to any type of educational or learning experience than a quantitative one. So, these sorts of perspectives are very much lacking in both the curriculum that we are asked to deliver and in the ways that we are taught to deliver it. So, while examining these issues, I found several key challenges that were emerging, and I did my best to try and decide what came first. So, if one barrier would cause another one to then exist, and it was a little difficult. It was a lot of the chicken and the egg sort of um, situations. So, I sort of put them in the order in which I think uh, leads to the each other. But I would love to hear what you guys think. That will be one of my questions. The first thing that I want to talk about is the cultural and policy constraints that exist worldwide. Some places more than others. But if you think that these things don't exist here in the Western world and Canada, then you might want to have a little deeper look. Obviously, it is true that in certain regions, cultural and political ideologies are going to completely limit or forbid discussions on gender equity in education. So the policymakers are not going to prioritize or probably even consider any type of curriculum or educational reform that's going to include um, the feminine perspective or even a change in the pedagogy that is being used to instruct. So, because of these socio political pressures, um, the systematic biases are just going to be further reinforced. Unless there is going to be very, very strong and consistent efforts to integrate feminine pedagogy, um, every the results are going to be fragmented and inconsistent, and ultimately probably not long lasting. The next barrier that I came across, and this was actually a really large one, is the gender biases that are in the curriculum content itself. One of the most persistent issues in mainstream curricula is the prioritization of the male perspectives, mainly because it was pretty much all males that wrote the curricula. Um, History, literature, and the sciences have traditionally been dominated by male figures and viewpoints, often sidelining or completely omitting the contributions of women. This underrepresentation limits students' exposure to diverse role models and, again, reinforces gender biases that suggest male contributions are more significant or valuable. And I did actually find some examples on this. In the United States in 1972, Title IX was passed. So, this was a very broad prescription against sex discrimination in any US government funded education programs or activities. So, if you want to think back to what that time was like, it was very a lot of protests going on, a lot of young people trying to change the world, and they did actually accomplish some pretty great changes. But once the title was passed, what was found is that apart from a few sort of broad gestures that looked good but didn't actually do anything, there was not really any changes done. So there were groups that took it upon themselves to create and to protest a lot of the stuff that was being taught in schools. So here is an example of what they used to prove that even though this law was passed, nothing was actually being done for it. So the quote from the textbook, and it's it's a lovely piece of writing. It is obvious that the lovely princess would have a difficult time finding a husband. No man would want a wife who could outdo him in so many ways. Josepha is wise enough to understand that her ability may prove her undoing. The activist's analysis of this is absolutely true. The teacher's manual accepts without comment that this situation, that the conventional courtship relationship in the story requires both the man and the woman to deceive each other and themselves. I'm not saying that things like this should not be shown in schools, but they should absolutely be examined and looked at and unpacked for what they are. Because simply taking things like this out of the education system does nothing to undo it. By opening it up and unpacking it and saying, why did this happen? Why was this the standard? And what can we do about it? That is what the feminine pedagogy would be in this particular situation. So, stemming from the curriculum biases and sort of one sided viewpoints, that's where I put the rigid assessment methods as another barrier to um, curriculum issues and challenges that our education systems have. So, traditional assessment models like standardized testing and rigid grading systems don't usually align with much of what is considered to be feminine pedagogy. Feminine pedagogy is often more with reflective learning, process orientated, and experiential, like very much more hands on than your present um, your standard tests, your multiple choices, fill in the blanks, and things like that. So typically in mainstream assessment practices are still using these testing methods. I know in Alberta, elementary schools are moving more towards a process based assessment system rather than a grading system. But once they get out of elementary school, or even junior high, then it is an immediate switch back to the traditional models that we see in high schools and college and universities. Alternative evaluation methods like portfolio based assessments, self reflection are seldom incorporated, but it's been proven time and time again that these are actually way more useful and way more forward thinking and provide foster deeper learning and more self awareness than just writing a test and being done with it. So, things like having presentations like this, and the forums that we talk back and forth on. These are more following in line with feminine pedagogy than um, any of the tests that we put our students through. The next barrier I want to talk about is the lack of inclusive pedagogical approaches. And this is one that I put right at the front, right at the back, and I decided to put it in the middle. So, in terms of the chicken and the egg, which came first. But the lack of inclusive pedagogical approaches is definitely one of the main barriers. So, mainstream education often emphasizes competition, hierarchy, individualism, um, like a lot of competition between people where you have, first place, second place, third place that's based on these standardized tests and these standardized marking systems. And that is very much in contrast with the core principles of feminine pedagogy. So again, the feminine pedagogy is collaboration, relational learning, and emotional engagements. So many curricula fail to integrate emotional intelligence, any type of care ethics, or any type of holistic development, which leads to a lack of support for students' social and emotional growth. And it's not just the girls that miss out here. Anybody, any human, should have access to these sorts of experiences in their education. Without these components, education risks becoming rigid, disconnected, and completely not involved with the student's lived experience, which means that it will be learned, it will be have the test taken, and then it will be completely disregarded, because why would you learn something that doesn't apply to you? The lack of teacher training on feminine pedagogy. Again, I wasn't sure where to put this one, because if you teach the teachers how to teach, then the students are going to benefit, but they need to have the curriculum to teach. So, again, it's another barrier that needs to be addressed. Educators are often not trained in pedagogical strategies that emphasize collaboration, empathy, and student centered learning. Professional development opportunities that focus on gender sensitive teaching methods are quite scarce, and here definitely scoffed at, in the nicest terms, I suppose. So, most teachers are going to feel ill equipped to implement feminine pedagogy in their classrooms. And without proper training, educators are going to struggle to create an inclusive, empowering learning environment. This one is a huge factor for me. Limited representation of feminist and gender studies. So, the fact that there are barely any courses to take on this, and um, our class is a prime example. There's not very many of us in this class, and realistically, I think in order to be an educator or an educator that teaches educators, it should be a required course. Feminist theory, gender studies, and social justice discussions remain very peripheral in many education systems. These topics are often framed as optional, like this one, supplementary, rather than being integral to understanding societal structures and power dynamics. This lack of representation perpetuates the ignorance regarding gender issues and limits students' abilities to critically engage with topics of equity and justice. And the fact that it is so under uh, encouraged, that it is so, oh, it's an option, it's not, you don't actually need to know this, absolutely sends the message to everybody that it's not a problem, it's not an issue. So it's just an option. You can learn coding too if you want. And that in itself is a huge part of the problem. I definitely could not do a presentation about the barriers that equity and education face without talking about resistance to change. So, traditional educational institutions often resist incorporating feminine pedagogy, basically just due to their deeply entrenched norms, right? So, these institutions prioritize rationality over emotion, competition over collaboration, and objectivity over subjectivity. And as much as they claim objectivity, they're still viewing it through that lens. They're still human. So if you are claiming it's objective, but it is all viewed through um, the male perspective, then that's not objective at all. Additionally, there is a perception that feminist pedagogy challenges authority structures. And this is back to the cultural and societal norms that I talked about at the beginning. So it becomes controversial, right? These institutional barriers hinder the implementation of more inclusive teaching methods. And it will take a long time for any of that to be changed, but it definitely needs that first domino to be hit. So I've talked about several key issues and barriers that are preventing our content and curriculum and education to be more equitable. And I've definitely added a lot of my own thoughts and opinions. So, what I can say is the three main places that I have teaching in my practice is I do teach in a school that is grade K to 9. I am also an Alberta Hunters Education instructor for the province, and I teach Indigenous education. I'm on the Specialist Council for the ATA. And one thing that I can say throughout all of it is, particularly with the Hunter's Education, I can speak to that. It is one book, it is the same textbook that has been used probably, I think, since about the 60s or 70s. And anybody who wants to get a tag or a license to hunt a deer or a goose or a duck has to take this course in Alberta. And when I took the course, it was taught by a man. And when you look at the list of instructors that are certified in Alberta, I believe it is 96% male. But I am definitely the most booked Hunter's Ed instructor in the city because I instruct it with a more feminine pedagogical approach. So when I teach Hunter's Ed, I teach it from an ethical standpoint. I teach it from an emotional standpoint because when you take that out, then you are missing most of what the education is supposed to be. So the ethics of taking the animal, the ethics of being respectful to people who don't hunt, those sorts of things aren't typically hit upon in most classes taught in Alberta. And so, what I'm finding is a lot of people are asking for me to take their course because, especially if they've got their children taking it, they want them to have that holistic knowledge because it is a traditional thing that we do here. So, moving forward, I think just having people experience a class with more gender equity in the pedagogy is one of the main things that is going to help break down some of these barriers. I have other suggestions too. So, some of the recommendations that would be so wonderful to see are to revise the curricula, to include more diverse perspectives and contributions from women and any other marginalized group. Like the whole idea is inclusion. And when you have one cultural or gendered group that is taking the lead in deciding what the curricula should entail, how it should be taught, and um, the stories and things that should be told from our past, you get a very, very narrow perspective. And even in math, it is interesting when you take something as black and white as numbers, they can absolutely be taught through a different lens that is very uninclusive. The second one is to implement pedagogical strategies that encourage collaboration, reflection, and emotional engagement. This has been seen taking root, particularly for those students that are just getting their teaching degrees here in Alberta. This particular implementation has started, and there have been a lot of professional development classes offered to teachers of Alberta to do these sorts of things. But again, that resistance to change is a hard thing to overcome. The third one is to train educators in gender sensitive and feminist pedagogical approaches, which I highlighted before. Classes such as the one that we are taking right now need to be required, not optional. And the fourth one is to develop alternative assessment methods that align with relational and process based learning. So anybody can knock out an essay that sounds good. But if they can show you and talk to you and have a conversation with you, that shows their deeper learning and have that back and forth, that is ultimately going to be a better educational process. So here's a quick look at some of the references that I used when I was doing my research. I want to thank you for watching my presentation and listening to me ramble on all about it. Um, I will be having my questions posted in the forum post, and I really look forward to hearing your responses. So thanks again.